This video presents an abridged and modified version of Black Shirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism by Michael Parenti. If you are interested in the content produced on this channel, consider lending your support at the links in the description below.
But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation. Namely, that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Only the people are poor. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
Over 1 century ago, in his great work, Les Miserables, Victor Hugo queried, "Will the future arrive?" Whether in the French Revolution at the dawn of the 19th century, or the communist revolutions of the 20th century, the struggle for a free and just society, founded on egalitarian principles, seems to be humanity's most persistent demand. After the overthrow and collapse of Soviet socialism, the world was told that liberal, democratic capitalism had triumphed, and that the historic quest for an alternative egalitarian social system had come to a close, with some even declaring the end of history. In today's increasingly decaying capitalist system, with ongoing corporate attacks against humanity and the planet, the rise of far-right politics, and a glaring failure of social democracy, we are compelled to rephrase Hugo's question and wonder, do we have any future at all? The class forces that exploit third world labor, destroy the natural environment, drive the economy into crises, and wage wars across the planet are the same class forces that pretend that there is no alternative to the capitalist system. The ruling class always tries to portray itself as the natural master of the prevailing social order, but history teaches us that the future does not belong to those who control the present. Truth is an uncomfortable venue for many of those entrenched within the prevailing anti-communist orthodoxy of the Western world. This video presents an invitation out of this historical confusion. It is an invitation to entertain certain unconventional views, to question the relationship between fascism and capitalism, question the narratives of right and left anti-communism, and to acknowledge the historic efforts of the often vilified Reds with a receptive but not uncritical mind.
Would you like to see colored home again, my friend? All you need to do is follow the words.
Born in 1883, the son of a blacksmith, young Benito Mussolini was a socialist organizer, agitator, and gifted journalist, with his early manhood marked by street brawls, arrests, and violent political activities. However, by the end of World War I, the Italian upper class began tempting him with recognition and promises of power, and he did not hesitate to switch sides. Mussolini the socialist, once a champion of workers and peasants, had become Mussolini the fascist, who broke strikes on behalf of financiers and landowners, and joined the black shirt terrorism of trade unionists, socialists, and farm cooperatives. After World War I, Italy had settled into a pattern of parliamentary democracy. The trains were running on time, pay scales were improving, but the economy was in a recession. The ruling class aimed to maintain their profit margins by slashing wages and raising prices, and to achieve this, democratic rights protecting the masses' living standards were abolished. In 1922, Industry leaders, banking representatives, and agribusiness associations collaborated, planned, and contributed 20 million lire to Mussolini to carry out the March on Rome. With the additional support of Italian military police, the March on Rome unfolded into a coup d'etat and Mussolini assumed power. Within 2 years of seizing state power, Mussolini silenced all opposition newspapers and crushed the Socialist, Liberal, Catholic, Democratic, and Republican parties, which together had commanded some 80% of the vote. The Italian Communist Party suffered the harshest repression of all, as it put up the most bitter resistance, not only to the black shirts, but to the German occupation forces as well. A similar pattern of collaboration between fascists and capitalists emerged in Germany, where business tycoons came to the conclusion that the Weimar Republic no longer served their class interests. Hitler's campaign was financed by industrialists, who also subsidized the Nazi SA, which formed anti-labor paramilitary groups to terrorize trade unions. Funds from big business also allowed Hitler to travel to a total of 50 cities in the last 2 weeks of the 1932 campaign alone, which yielded the Nazis an unprecedented 37.3% of the vote. In the 1932 election, 3 candidates ran for president: the conservative incumbent Field Marshal von Hindenburg, the Nazi candidate Adolf Hitler, and the Communist Party candidate Ernst Thälmann. In his campaign, Thälmann argued that a vote for Hindenburg amounted to a vote for Hitler, and that Hitler would lead Germany into a war. Despite these prophetic warnings from the communists, Hindenburg was re-elected and Hitler was appointed chancellor. The communists attempted to form an 11th hour coalition with the Social Democrats, but true to social democratic form, they preferred to ally themselves with the reactionary right than make common cause with the Reds. In both Italy in the 1920s and Germany in the 1930s, these two nations, with different histories, cultures, languages, and supposedly different temperaments, ended up with the same repressive solutions to class conflict. Fascism reintroduced old industrial evils, thought to have passed permanently into history as the conditions of labor deteriorated. In the name of saving society from the Red Menace, minimum wage laws, overtime hours, restrictions on child labor, and safety regulations were abolished. Unions and strikes were outlawed, while the property of unions and farm cooperatives was confiscated and handed over to rich private owners. Both Mussolini and Hitler also showed their gratitude to their big business patrons by privatizing many perfectly solvent state assets, including steel mills, power plants, banks, and steamship companies. At the same time, they raised taxes for the general population, but lowered or eliminated them for the rich and big businesses. They crushed organized labor and eradicated all elections, opposition parties, and independent publications, while hundreds of thousands of political opponents were either imprisoned, tortured, or murdered until socialist dissidents were virtually non-existent. In addition to fascism serving the interests of capital, it also served the personal interests of fascist leaders. Hitler, often portrayed as an ideological fanatic, amassed great sums of wealth through his connections to the business community, and lived indulgently during his time in office. Hitler not only had a secret slush fund donated by leading German industrialists, but stole fine art from the public domain, and even made hundreds of millions of marks from personally claiming royalties on German postage stamps. He did not pay taxes, had a motorcade of limousines, private apartments, a vast staff of servants, as well as a large estate in the Alps where he entertained European royalty such as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, great admirers of the Führer. Italian fascism and German Nazism also had their admirers within the US business community and the corporate-owned press. Bankers, publishers, and industrialists such as Henry Ford traveled to Rome and Berlin to pay homage, receive medals, and strike profitable deals with the Italian and German governments. Many did their utmost to advance the Nazi war effort by sharing military-industrial secrets or engaging in secret transactions with the Nazi government. The Rockefeller family's Chase National Bank laundered Nazi money, while corporations like DuPont, Ford, General Motors, and ITT owned factories in enemy countries that produced fuel, tanks, and planes that wreaked havoc on Allied forces. Despite these acts of treason, many of these US corporations were later compensated for damages inflicted on their property during the war, such as ITT, which collected $27 million, or GM, which collected over $33 million. During bombing campaigns, Allied pilots were given instructions not to hit factories in Germany that were owned by US firms. The German city of Cologne, for example, was almost completely leveled by Allied bombing, but its Ford plant remained unscathed to the point that German civilians even began using it as an air raid shelter. Throughout Mussolini and Hitler's rise to power, progressives and labor leaders of all stripes were denouncing fascism as a great threat to democracy. While these sentiments were initially overshadowed by more sympathetic tones towards Hitler, this began to change as Japan formed closer ties with the Axis powers. After attacking a US military base in Hawaii, the Americans declared war, and from this point on, the media took on a decisively critical tone towards fascism. Anti-fascist critics often stress the irrational features of fascism, which can sometimes overlook the rational, political-economic functions that fascism performed. While it is true that fascist politics is based on an ideology of irrational and manipulated symbols, it also has a rational class control function. Take, for example, the cult of the leader. Many writers emphasize how these cults are based on an uncritical acceptance of a mythology built through propaganda to idolize a national leader. But such accounts overlook the ways in which the cult of the leader performed rational functions such as workforce discipline. As Mussolini wrote, "The fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state." The cult of the leader therefore absorbs individual identities into the state, which are given expression through the supreme leader. Under such a politics, the people are no longer to be concerned with class divisions, but must see themselves as part of a harmonious whole, rich and poor as one, where exploitation no longer exists. In this way, fascism attempts to cloak the ongoing system of exploitation by turning class struggle into everlasting struggle against an external enemy threatening the harmony of the state and its people. It is an ideology that gives rise to a type of fetishism towards violence. Mussolini, in 1934, said that peace is hostile to fascism and is a depressing doctrine because only cruel struggle, conquest, and war alone put the stamp of nobility upon the people who have the courage to meet it. And although words are beautiful things, rifles, machine guns, planes, and cannons are still more beautiful. Fascism is dedicated to monistic values and a one-dimensional view of the people as a single community or nation. It is a value system that is buttressed by a mythical view of the people as a superior race. Fascist doctrine, especially the Nazi variety, makes an explicit commitment to racial supremacy, where class struggle is replaced by racial struggle. Class status is said to be inherited through blood, as one's position in the social structure is taken as a measure of one's inherent nature. In Nazi Germany, racism and anti-Semitism served to misdirect legitimate grievances towards convenient scapegoats. Super patriots were told that Jews were alien internationalists. Unemployed workers were told that their nemesis was the Jewish capitalist and Jewish banker. Indebted farmers were told it was the Jewish usurer, and for the middle class, it was the Jewish union leader and Jewish communist. Along with race and class inequality, fascism is also rabidly patriarchal and homophobic. One of the most powerful Nazis, SS leader Heinrich Himmler, saw homosexuals as a threat to German manhood because a homosexual sissy would not procreate or make a good soldier. Himmler, like all Nazis, believed that every man should be a husband, father, or soldier, and that a woman's greatest calling was to devoutly tend to the needs of her family while bearing as many offspring for the state as she could. This patriarchal ideology was linked to a conservative class ideology that saw all forms of social equality as a threat to hierarchical control and privilege. Keeping women in line brought stability to the family, which in turn brought stability to the state on which the wealth and power of the ruling class rested. Fascism is similar to conservative ideologies in other ways as well, but what makes it unique is how it masks its reactionary class politics behind the cloak of revolutionary slogans. Fascists launched youth organizations and mass mobilizations, work brigades, rallies, and parades, with banners, symbols, and slogans. But this so-called Nazi revolution, which was supposed to sweep away the old order and revitalize society, proved to be nothing but a violent restoration of the old order. This partly explains why denazification took such a mild form in post-war Italy and West Germany. Aside from putting some of the top leaders on trial at Nuremberg, the Western capitalist allies did little to eradicate fascism from Italy or Germany. Within a year after the war, almost all Italian fascists were released from prison, while hundreds of communists and other left partisans who had been fighting the Nazi occupation were jailed. History was turned on its head, transforming the black shirts into victims and the reds into criminals. In contrast, when the communists took over East Germany, they removed roughly 80% of the judges, teachers, and officials for collaborating with the Nazis. They imprisoned 1,000, executed 600 Nazi Party leaders, and would have shot more had not hundreds of these war criminals fled to the protective embrace of the West. Many Nazi war criminals found a haven in the United States, and some of them even found lucrative employment in US agencies such as NASA during the Cold War. The US also played a major role in resurrecting Italian fascism as a buttress against the Communist Party's popularity. In the 30 years after World War II, the US gave an approximate $75 million to right-wing movements in Italy, which helped finance and establish a NATO-inspired anti-communist mercenary force that launched a terror and sabotage campaign known as the Strategy of Tension. Between 1969 to 1974, terrorist conspirators carried out a series of kidnappings, assassinations, and bombing massacres, including one at a Bologna train station that killed 85 people and injured roughly 200. Similar terrorist attacks also killed scores of people in Germany, Belgium, and other European countries, but went mostly unreported in the US corporate-owned media. The Strategy of Tension was designed to create enough popular fear and uncertainty as to undermine the existing social democracies. By 1994, the Strategy of Tension seemed to have finally bore fruit as the Italian election was won by the National Alliance, a version of the neo-fascist MSI, which campaigned for lower taxes, combating immigration, and curtailing unemployment benefits. They used an upbeat Reaganite optimism to replace jackboot militarists, used the media to convince workers that the government was the enemy, strengthened the repressive capacities of the state, instigated racist hostility towards immigrants, preached the mythical virtues of the free market, and pursued economic reforms that redistributed income upward. The Italian neo-fascists were learning from the US reactionaries how to achieve fascism's class goals within the confines of a liberal democracy.
Stamattina mi sono alzato, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Stamattina mi sono alzato e ho trovato l'invaso, oh partigiano, portami via, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire.
After the emergence of major communist powers like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, US foreign policy became devoted to the suppression of revolutionary governments and radical movements across the world. While posing as a beacon of freedom, the United States has proven to be the greatest anti-democratic force in the world. It has assumed the self-appointed task of policing the entire globe while most people of the world just want the US to go home and mind its own affairs. Nations and people of the world need their sovereignty, land, labor, natural resources, and markets to serve their own social needs, not the needs of foreign corporations and investors. There are many third world organizations that have built homes, established health clinics, carried out food programs, redistributed land, launched literacy campaigns or job programs without the help of Western investment, and these countries could implement many more reforms if they weren't stonewalled by capital or attacked for being communists. In Western media, communists are cartoonishly depicted as pathologically evil, demonic conspirators that seek power for power's sake. But anti-communist opinion makers never spell out what revolutionary communist governments actually do in terms of socio-economic policy in China, Cuba, Vietnam, or the Soviet Union. They never utter a word about the nationalization of lands held by rich, exploitive landlords, or speak about the mass programs for education, health, housing, and jobs. They never mention how hundreds of millions of people living in countries that had long suffered under the yoke of feudal oppression and Western colonial pillage had advanced their own well-being, living standards, and life chances under communism far beyond what they had under capitalism. The true offense of these communist societies wasn't that they oppressed people, but that they championed the interests of the laboring classes against the wealthy elite. They advocated for a redistribution of class power and wealth, and promoted the collective betterment of the working populace, rather than a select few. Communists asserted the people's right to benefit from the resources of their own country, and seized the property of the wealthy elite to redistribute among the masses towards the goal of social development. Communism demonstrated an alternative social system to capitalism, and was therefore ruthlessly demonized and attacked by the capitalist class and its privately owned media.
What we hear also is that there's another pernicious element, and the thing we have to stop in these countries is a thing called communism, and that there are communists in these countries. It's time, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, it's time we ask, what's a communist? What does a communist do that is so dangerous? They would have us believe that communists merely hunger for power rather than wanting the power to end hunger. And I said to myself, what is undesirable and offensive about Managua? Is it the land reform program, where they took all that massive land owned by those few rich compradors and gave it out to the people who were starved for land? Is it the farm co-ops that they're setting up? Is it the community industries and the public work programs to create jobs for people who have been chronically unemployed? Is it the food program, a ration of beans and rice for every kid in Nicaragua so that nobody, no matter how poor that country is, they're all getting fed? Is it having the lowest infant mortality rate in Central America despite earthquake and civil war and foreign invasion and attack and embargo? Lower even than Costa Rica, which is supposed to be the big show place? What's so offensive about Managua? It is those things in some degree. It is creating a competing social order. It is people, it is those who have been downtrodden, it has been those who have been used as fodder in the capital accumulation process, now claiming back the process of production, claiming back their own land, claiming back their own flag, their own dignity, and saying, this country is going to be for us and not for you anymore, gringo.
Western capital not only sought to discredit communism through an endless stream of anti-red propaganda and disinformation, but took considerable measures to violently dismantle the entire social structure. While combating communism in the name of freedom, US forces and surrogate forces launched what can only be described as a free market world holocaust. The US slaughtered 2 million North Koreans, 3 million Vietnamese, over 500,000 in Laos and Cambodia, 1.5 million in Angola, over 1 million in Mozambique, over 500,000 in Afghanistan, up to 1 million in Indonesia, 200,000 in East Timor, 100,000 in Nicaragua, over 100,000 in Guatemala, over 700,000 in Iraq, over 60,000 in El Salvador, 30,000 in Argentina, 35,000 in Taiwan, 20,000 in Chile, and many thousands more in Haiti, Panama, Grenada, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, and dozens of other countries. In the name of combating communism and saving democracy, the US dropped a quantity of explosives on Vietnam many times more than what was used by all combatants throughout World War II. And as this genocidal massacre was unfolding, anti-communist propaganda saturated Western airwaves, schools, and political discourse with repeated and often fictitious references to the tyranny of the Red Menace. Whether in the case of the Russians, the Chinese, the Cubans, the Algerians, the Koreans, or the Vietnamese, revolutions always begin peacefully. The peaceful path is always the first option of any people involved in political struggle, but violent and relentless attacks by anti-communists make peaceful revolution impossible and armed struggle inevitable. In this sense, the greatest purveyors of so-called revolutionary violence are from the counter-revolutionaries seeking to prevent social reforms, not from the revolutionaries fighting for them. Revolutionaries are not zealots with a martyrdom complex, seeking mortal combat with an enemy that enjoys every advantage in firepower and mobility. Revolutionaries are simply working people struggling for national independence as well as economic and political reforms. It is only because of their unflinching determination that people's armies have been able to defend themselves against such overwhelming and aggressive attacks by imperialism. Historically, US leaders have been far more combative of authoritarian governments when these governments are communist rather than fascist. This is because fascism tries to save the capitalist mode of production from morbid crises, while communism seeks to let the system die while facilitating a transition to a more equal and free society. Revolutionary governments foster national self-determination and economic development, which extends new freedoms such as the freedom from the worst forms of class, racial, and patriarchal oppression. Communism introduces the freedom to speak, the freedom to politically organize, the freedom to access education and pursue a livelihood, the freedom to worship or not worship, the freedom to health, freedom to enjoy culture, and so on. Meanwhile, many of the freedoms taken for granted in capitalist societies are criminalized and harshly penalized by communist governments, such as the freedom to invest privately without regard to human and environmental costs, the freedom to live in obscene opulence while paying workers starvation wages, the freedom to treat the state as a private agency in the service of a privileged few, the freedom to employ child labor and child prostitutes, or the freedom to treat women as chattel. Throughout the history of capitalism, the human cost of such unfettered freedoms by the wealthy elite is unrecorded, incalculable, and often forgotten when the revolution distributes justice to oligarchs and oppressors. We make no tally of the generations claimed by economic exploitation and political suppression, the hapless victims of flood and famine in the Yangtze Valley, the child prostitutes found dead in the back alleys of old Shanghai, the peasants stricken by cold and starvation across the frozen plains of Russia. No one tallies the thousands of nameless victims who succumbed to US-trained death squads in Latin America, the hundreds of villages burned to the ground by counterinsurgency forces, the millions who are driven from their ancestral lands and sentenced to permanently stunted and malnourished lives, the millions more who perish in the desperate misery and congestion of shanty slums and internment camps. No tally of the pain inflicted on the tens of millions of children throughout the world, many as young as 6 and 7, who are forced to work up to 70 hours a week. No measure of the countless third world workers confined to conditions reminiscent of the most horrific days of the Industrial Revolution. Such were the revolutionary conditions in Cuba during the overthrow of the US-supported right-wing Batista regime. During this period, one journalist described a spectacle of almost unrelieved poverty, with sugar farmers commonly living on the brink of starvation, the rural population living in makeshift shacks, houses with minimal sanitation, malnourished children, barefoot pedestrians walking on dirt roads, and widespread illnesses with almost no doctors or schools anywhere nearby. But today, well after the revolution, Cuba is a different place. For all its mistakes and abuses, the Cuban Revolution has introduced sanitation, schools, health clinics, jobs, housing, and human services to a level not found throughout most of the Third World, or even in many parts of the First World. Between 1960 to 1991, infant mortality dropped from 6 to less than 1%. Life expectancy rose from 55 to 75. Smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, typhoid, polio, and numerous other diseases were wiped out, all while literacy increased to a rate higher than most third world countries and even some advanced industrial nations. This small Caribbean country remains a lasting beacon of hope and inspiration for revolutions across the world. Cuba has not only made tremendous achievements in providing its people with the necessities of a dignified life, but has done so while suffering under a punishing economic blockade imposed by the US. Cuba is being punished to this day simply because it has dared to develop an alternative socio-economic order that places corporate property under public ownership, abolishes capitalist investors as a class, puts people before profits, and prioritizes national independence before IMF servitude. Why are they blockading Cuba? Because no other country has done more for its people. It's the hatred of the ideas that Cuba represents. For over 100 years, the US ruling class has tirelessly propagated anti-communism among the populace until it became more like a religious orthodoxy than a political analysis. During the Cold War, the anti-communists transformed any data about existing socialist societies into hostile evidence. If the churches in the USSR were empty, this demonstrated that religion was suppressed. But if the churches were full, this meant that people were rejecting the regime's atheism. If the workers went on strike, this was evidence of their alienation from the collectivist system. If they didn't go on strike, this was because they were intimidated and lacked freedom. In the US, if communists played an important role struggling for the rights of workers, the poor, African Americans, women, or others, this was only their cunning way of gathering support and power for themselves. The relentless perpetuation of anti-red propaganda has not only blinded conservatives and liberals to the realities of communism, but many who claim to identify with socialism as well. Left anti-communists pose themselves against the corporate state, but then side with it in attacking any and all examples of actually existing socialism in the Third World. One of the most prominent and identifiable thinkers to take up this position has been Noam Chomsky, who argues that fascism and Bolshevism were both right-wing movements that sprang out of the same totalitarian soil that gave rise to corporations. He claims that the Bolsheviks were left intellectuals who rose to power on the backs of mass popular movements and then beat the people into submission. You start off as basically a Leninist, who's going to be part of the red bureaucracy. You see later that power doesn't lie that way, and so you very quickly become an ideologist of the right. We're seeing it right now in the former Soviet Union. The same guys who were communist thugs 2 years back are now running banks and are enthusiastic free marketeers and praising Americans. Chomsky's imagery is heavily indebted to the same US corporate political culture he so frequently criticizes on other issues. In his mind, the revolution was betrayed by a group of communist thugs who merely hunger for power rather than wanting the power to end hunger. But in falling back on the old stereotype of power-hungry Reds who pursue power for power's sake without regard for any actual social goals, the question is raised.
If communists, if we leftists, if we Marxists, if we revolutionaries, if we progressives, if we all we want is to hunger for power, then why do we side with the powerless? Then why don't we toady up to power, like the political climbers and careers have done in every country in the world? And we on the left don't do that. We stand out in the rain. We stand out on the picket lines. We put our jobs on the line. We risk our careers. In many cases, we even risk our physical safety and our lives in all sorts of countries. If it's power we want, why do we take such a circuitous route?
Another prototypic red basher who pretended to be on the left was George Orwell. In the middle of World War II, as the Soviet Union was fighting for its life against the Nazi invaders at Stalingrad, Orwell announced that a willingness to criticize Russia and Stalin is the test of intellectual honesty. It is the only thing that from a literary intellectual's point of view is really dangerous. Safely ensconced within a rabidly anti-communist society, Orwell's doublethink characterized the condemnation of communism as a lonely, courageous act of defiance. And today, his ideological progeny are still at it, offering themselves as intrepid left critics of the left, waging a courageous struggle against hordes of imaginary Marxist-Leninist Stalinists. Absurd claims and unfounded criticisms of the Soviet Union have become so prevalent in mainstream political discourse that writers and academics have become increasingly laxed in their academic rigor. Even centrists, such as Adam Hochschild, noting this trend, encouraged his fellow liberals to be more accurate in their reporting and condemnation of communist societies, alarmed that the growing trend of lazy research would weaken their credibility. Sorely lacking within the anti-communist left is any rational evaluation of the Soviet Union, a nation that endured a protracted civil war and multinational foreign invasion in the very first years of its existence, and then later threw back and destroyed the Nazi beast at an enormous cost to itself. There is scant evaluation of how the Soviets made such great industrial advancements, equal to what capitalism took a century to accomplish, while feeding and schooling its children, rather than working them 14 hours a day, as capitalist industrialists did and still do in many parts of the world. Saturated by anti-communist orthodoxy, most US leftists not only toe the ideological line of anti-communism, but have practiced a type of left McCarthyism against people who have something positive to say about existing communism. Communist academics are almost entirely excluded from participation in conferences, advisory boards, political endorsements, or many left publications. Those of us who refuse to join in the anti-Soviet bashing are branded by these left communists as Soviet apologists or Stalinists. Even if we disliked or disagreed with Stalin and his autocratic system of rule, and even if we offered serious critiques of the problems of existing Soviet society, any form of agreement was seen as too far beyond the pale. Our real sin is that unlike many on the left who are rewarded for their intellectual laziness and conformity, we refuse to uncritically swallow US media propaganda about communist societies, and instead critically examine their virtues as well as their weaknesses. Once again, Noam Chomsky, who has an inexhaustible supply of anti-communist caricatures, says that Western and also Third World intellectuals were attracted to the Bolshevik counter-revolution because Leninism is, after all, a doctrine that says that the radical intelligentsia have a right to take state power and to run their countries by force, and that is an idea which is rather appealing to intellectuals. Here, Chomsky fashions an image of power-hungry intellectuals to go along with his cartoon image of power-hungry Leninists, as villains seeking not the revolutionary means to fight injustice, but power for power's sake. Left anti-communists like Chomsky find any association with communist organizations as morally unacceptable, yet many of them are themselves associated with or openly support the Democratic Party, either as voters or as members.
I mean, if you
you're in Ohio this November, you vote Clinton rather than Donald Trump or Ted Cruz?
Oh, absolutely. Just as I would in 2000. I didn't like Obama, but I said exactly the same thing.
While posing blanket denunciations of the Soviet Union for the purported crimes it committed, Chomsky is still willing to vote for a party whose crimes include the arbitrary imprisonment of 120,000 Japanese Americans, the dropping of atomic bombs, the Smith Act, the Neutrality Act, the Vietnam War, and extensive racial segregation, discrimination, and violence perpetrated by democratic presidents at home. This is why the fall of socialism was largely met with indifference among the US left. According to anti-communist leftists, the upheavals in Eastern Europe and the toppling of communist governments did not constitute a defeat for socialism because socialism never actually existed in those countries. But regardless of definitions, these states we refer to as communist did in fact constitute something different from what existed in the profit-driven capitalist world in at least 4 ways. Number 1. Communist societies had less economic inequality than they did under capitalism. Soviet leaders lived not in mansions like the White House, but in relatively large apartments in a housing project near the Kremlin. The purportedly lavish life enjoyed by East Germany's party leaders, as widely publicized in the US press, included a $725 yearly allowance in hard currency, as well as housing in an exclusive settlement on the outskirts of Berlin, which had a sauna, an indoor pool, and a fitness center shared by all the residents. Residents here could also shop in stores that carried Western goods, such as bananas, jeans, and Japanese electronics. Second, in communist countries, the means of production were not organized for capital gain and private enrichment, but were placed under some form of public ownership. Individuals could not hire other people and accumulate great personal wealth from their labor. The stock market was abolished, and the income between the highest and lowest earners shrank to about 5 to 1. In contrast, the division between the top multi-billionaires and the working poor in the US was about 10,000 to 1. Third, priority was placed on human services. While it is true that in comparison to the West, life under communism left a lot to be desired, it demonstrated a dramatic improvement in the living standards of countless people across the world. While rarely the best or highest quality, communist countries did guarantee their citizens some minimal standard of economic survival and security, including guaranteed education, employment, housing, and medical assistance. Reforms that addressed issues that continue to create great social problems for capitalist countries in the advanced industrial West. Fourth, communist countries did not pursue the capital penetration of other countries. Unlike capitalist nations, which are always under the threat of crises and are therefore perpetually compelled to expand across the world, communism had no internal necessity towards growth, and therefore did not rely on economic imperialism to expropriate the land, labor, or resources of other countries. The Soviet Union, for example, conducted trade and aid relations on terms that were generally favorable to its partners in the Eastern European nations, Mongolia, Cuba, and India. Despite these tangible gains, the left anti-communists argue that real, pure socialism would be controlled by the workers themselves through direct participation instead of being run by Leninists, Stalinists, Castroites, or other ill-willed, power-hungry bureaucracies of evil men. The idealism of pure socialists imagines what socialism would look like in a world far better than this one, where no state force is required, and where none of the value produced by workers needs to be expropriated to build society and its defenses. In an ideal world, it would be a fine thing to have only local, self-directed worker participation with minimal bureaucracy, police, and military, and this probably would be how socialism developed if it were ever free from counter-revolutionary subversion and attack. For a people's revolution to survive, it must seize state power and use it to break the stranglehold exercised by the owning class and withstand its inevitable reactionary counterattack. The pure socialists feel no need to explain how the manifold functions of a revolutionary society would be organized, how external attack and internal sabotage would be thwarted, how bureaucracy would be avoided, scarce resources allocated, policy differences settled, priorities set, or production and distribution conducted. Instead, they offer vague statements about how the workers themselves will directly own and control the means of production and will arrive at their own solutions through creative struggle. They demand that workers take control over production and spontaneously organize a repressive state apparatus without the direction of centralized plans, bureaucratic managers, or top-down procedures. This was a question confronting the Soviets in the late 1920s when the USSR faced the difficult choice of either moving the economy in a more liberal direction or planning for forced industrialization. The liberal direction would have produced a more comfortable, more humane, and serviceable society, but the country would have risked being incapable of withstanding the Nazi onslaught. Stalin predicted that if Soviet industrialization failed to do in 10 years what the West had accomplished in 100 years, then the Europeans would destroy the USSR, and therefore the Soviets embarked upon a rigorous process of forced industrialization. The prophecy of Stalin's words were recognized in 1941 when Nazi Germany began its mobilization of millions of troops into Soviet territory. By this point, the Soviets had built a large industrial base thousands of miles from the front, which supplied the war resources needed to turn the tide against the Nazi invaders and push them all the way back to Berlin. Without having much to say about the historic confrontation between the Nazis and the Soviets, or the economic planning that prepared the communists for victory, the pure socialists offer a version of socialism built from a new society that will create and be created by new people, a society so transformed in its fundamentals as to leave little opportunity for wrongful acts, corruption, violence, and criminal abuses of state power. There would be no bureaucracy or self-interested groups, no ruthless conflicts or hurtful decisions. The pure socialists, therefore, see socialism as an ideal that was tarnished by the Soviet model, but they offer little evidence to demonstrate that other paths could have been taken, that other models of socialism, not created from one's imagination, but developed through actual historical experience, could have taken hold and worked better. The pure socialists simply compare their vision of socialism in an ideal world against the socialism that emerges through our imperfect reality, with the reality always coming off as a poor second. In fact, the pure socialists even go so far as to regularly blame the left itself for every defeat it suffers. They say that revolutionary struggles fail because their leaders wait too long or act too soon, are too timid or too impulsive, too stubborn or too easily swayed. When the reality of building socialism proves different and more difficult than they imagined, some on the left proceed to condemn the real thing and announce that they feel betrayed by this or that revolution. It should therefore come as no surprise that there has never been a successful revolution as described by the pure socialists, and that they support every revolution except the ones that succeed. During the period of siege socialism, central planning was useful and even necessary to produce steel, wheat, and tanks in order to build an industrial base and withstand the Nazi onslaught. But the rigid top-down economic command systems eventually hindered technological development and proved incapable of supplying a wide enough range of consumer goods and services. Stagnation was evident in the failure of Soviet industry to apply scientific and technological innovations of the 1970s and 80s, particularly computer technologies. Capitalism ensured economic productivity through market competition. Capitalists compete with one another for higher profits, while workers compete with each other for employment and higher wages under the threat of becoming homeless or going hungry. But under the Soviet system, where shelter, food, and a job were constitutionally guaranteed human rights, the threat of being fired, losing your home, or going hungry no longer motivated workers to innovate or compete. The disappearance of the market also skewed rewards away from a system based on consumer demand and into one based on the demands of the state. In Vietnam, for instance, state prices of meat were based on quantity rather than quality, and therefore, collective farmers maximized profits by producing fatter animals. Consumers might not care to eat fatty meat, but that was their problem. Only a foolish or saintly farmer would work harder to produce better quality meat for the privilege of getting paid less. In many factories, administrative personnel increased at a faster rate than productive workers, and this type of heavily bureaucratic mode of operation also lacked the necessary mechanisms for critical self-corrective feedback. Meanwhile, those who exposed waste, incompetence, and corruption were more likely to run risks than receive rewards. The people of communist countries often complain less about overbearing control than about the absence of responsible control. There was lax management in harvesting, storage, and transportation of agricultural goods, with as much as 30% of total produce lost between field and store, and instances where thousands of tons of meat were left to spoil. In restaurants, poorer service meant fewer customers, and more food left over for the workers to take home for themselves or sell on the black market. The last thing restaurant personnel wanted was satisfied customers who would return to dine at the officially fixed low prices. The state also struggled to distribute the goods that would guarantee the new rights and freedoms of Soviet citizens. The state often failed to perform needed repairs on housing, introduced long wait lists for cars and homes, and faced problems with getting occupants to pay rent. People complained about broken toilets, leaky roofs, rude salespeople, poor quality goods, late trains, deficient hospital services, and corrupt and unresponsive bureaucrats. The poorer the performance of plumbers and mechanics, the less burdened they were with calls and quotas, and if a worker was fired, they had a constitutional guarantee to another job, and seldom had any difficulty finding one. The communists operated on the assumption that once capitalism and its attendant economic abuses were eliminated, and once all social production was communalized, and people were afforded some decent measure of security and prosperity, they would contently do their fair share of work. But even in the best of societies, there is often not enough interesting and creative work to go around for all who consider themselves to be interesting and creative people. This new approach to the production and distribution of goods throughout society undoubtedly produced contradictory outcomes and social problems that needed to be worked out. But the complaints of people suffering from these problems hardly resembled those of a people trembling under a totalitarian rule of terror. In reality, communist economies had a kind of wonderland quality, in that prices seldom bore any relation to actual cost or value. Many expensive services were provided almost entirely free, such as education, medical care, and most recreational, sporting, and cultural events, while housing, transportation, utilities, and basic foods were heavily subsidized. Many people had money, but not much to buy with it, and luxury items were very rare to come by. Prices were held artificially low, first out of a dedication to egalitarian principles, but also because later attempts to raise them provoked worker protests in Poland, East Germany, and the USSR. Soviet citizens were expected to play by the rules and not take advantage of the system, even when the system inadvertently invited transgressions. They were expected to discard a self-interested mode of behavior when in fact there was no reward and often some disadvantage in doing so. There were strong resentments concerning consumer scarcities, the endless shopping lines, the 10-year wait for a new automobile, the housing shortage, or a 5-year wait for a new apartment. Crowded homes and financial dependency on parents often forced people into early marriage, early divorce, or other issues with intimate relationships. These types of problems, combined with Western propaganda making its way into the Soviet bloc, took their toll on the people's commitment to socialism. People eventually took for granted what they had in way of human services and began to compare their lifestyle to that of the consumerist West. Leading professionals who had attained relatively good living standards wanted to dress better, travel abroad, and enjoy the more abundant lifestyles available to people of means in the capitalist world. In 1990s Cuba, for example, many youth saw no value in joining the Communist Party and thought that Fidel Castro should step down. By the second or third generation, relatively few Cubans are still alive who can favorably contrast their lives under socialism with the great hardships and injustices of the pre-revolutionary days. For the youth, Cuba's accomplishments in education and medical care are something they take for granted and cannot get excited about. Generally, they're more concerned about their own personal future than about socialism. University courses on Marxism and courses on the Cuban Revolution, once over-enrolled, now go sparsely attended, while students crowd into classes on global markets and property law. People in communist countries could be convinced of the superiority and luxurious lifestyle of the West because Western capital spent billions on marketing manipulated images of life under capitalism. In the communist countries, where there was nothing comparable, media coverage generally consisted of dull protocol visits and official pronouncements, along with glowing reports about the economy and society. With almost religious fervor, many third-world intellectuals from socialist countries maintained that the capitalist West was a free market paradise of abundance and opportunity. Well-fed, university-educated Moscow intellectuals, sitting in their modest but comfortable apartments, would tell US visitors with complete certitude that the poorest among you live better than we. There was a strong belief in the meritocracy of capitalism. They acknowledged the widespread poverty, but truly believed that anyone could make it if they just worked hard enough. Admiration for capitalism even sometimes extended to tolerance for Western imperialism, as reflected in a remark made by a Soviet official who suggested that third world countries suffer not so much from capitalism as from a lack of it. In the late 1980s, leaders in the Soviet Union and other European communist nations made a desperate attempt to save socialism by opening their economies to Western investment. It was anticipated that state ownership would exist on equal terms with cooperatives, foreign investors, and domestic private entrepreneurs. But in fact, the whole state economy was put at risk and eventually undermined. Communist leaders showed a surprisingly un-Marxist understanding of the problems they faced and scant analysis of why and how their socialist system had come to such a weakness. Marx's critique of capitalism seemed to have no relevance or meaning for those who lived in a non-capitalist society. As a system of analysis mainly concerned with existing capitalism, Marxism has relatively little to say about the economic development of socialist societies, and without this reference to reality within the socialist world, Marxism was often interpreted as dogmatism rather than a critique of actual material conditions. Instead, most intellectuals found excitement in the forbidden fruit of Western bourgeois ideology, not to broaden the socialist spectrum, but to replace it with a right-wing anti-communist orthodoxy. However, not everyone in the socialist world romanticized capitalism or agreed with the introduction of liberal reforms. Many of the Soviet and Eastern European émigrés who had migrated to the United States knew and complained about the poor social services, high crime rates, harsh work conditions, lack of communal spirit, vulgar electoral campaigns, inferior educational standards, and astonishing ignorance towards history. They discovered they could no longer leave their jobs during the day to go shopping, that their employers provided no company doctor when they fell ill, that they were subject to severe reprimands when tardy, that they could not walk the streets and parks late at night without fear. They worried about affording medical services for their family, college tuition for their children, and were constantly concerned about losing their job at any moment. The paradox of socialist economies was that in satisfying basic human needs and solving certain social problems, it created new needs and new social problems which the Western world appeared more readily able to solve. Soviet economic development successfully industrialized semi-feudal, war-torn, devastated countries and brought a better life for most people, but in doing so also created expectations that could not be fulfilled. As socialism improved the lives of many, lots of people began desiring all the securities of socialism overlaid with capitalist consumerism. Eventually, the desire for Western standards of living drew enough people away from socialist revolution and towards bourgeois Western thought as to undermine the entire Soviet socialist project. However, while it is true that the communist system of production and distribution had internal difficulties, deficiencies within the communist system were exacerbated by unrelenting external attacks and threats from Western powers. The transition to a fully socialist economy was made nearly impossible because the counter-revolution never ceased and was eventually successful. In 1989, the fall of communism was symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall. The decline of communism not only brought devastation to the working population, but also empowered Nazi sympathizers, hate groups, and all sorts of political scum who began to float to the surface.